of London, mighty fortress and royal palace, infamous prison and place of execution.
William the Conqueror built it as his English stronghold 900 years ago. Ever since, some of the biggest and most notorious names in England's history, from Anne Boleyn to Guy Fawkes, have been jailed, tortured and put to death here.
Their stories are the stuff of myth and legend, but the truth is even more extraordinary.
I'm Dr. Susanna Lipscomb, Tudor historian and author.
And I'm Joe Crowley, journalist and investigator.
Together, we want to reveal the secret history of the tower.
Hunting down evidence.
It's like a sweet shop for a historian.
Making some shocking discoveries.
That is quite incredible.
And coming to some very surprising conclusions.
Everyone's very sure that this was a complete stitch-up.
This must have been an inside job. Think you know the Tower of London?
Time to think again.
In this episode, Traitors. We're investigating the hidden stories of 3 men who dared challenge the English state and were sent to the tower to die.
Up first, there's the outlaw priest who attempted a midnight prison break.
It's a fascinating story and he's written down every detail.
Then, England's first terrorist, Guy Fawkes, a victim of savage torture.
It would be exquisitely painful, but there is nothing that would kill you in the short term.
And finally, the last man executed at the tower, a German spy, in 1941.
It's a piece of trivia for most people, and he was my grandfather. You know, he ended up being executed far from his family, unable to say his last goodbyes.
All 3 were men on a mission. All 3 were enemies of the state.
It's the 4th of October, 1597, in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. At the Tower of London, Father John Gerard is spending his final night in prison. His crime is to be a Catholic priest in a Protestant country, an often fatal offence. More than 100 priests have already been slaughtered in Queen Elizabeth's reign. But John Gerard is not about to join that list. Instead, tonight he will carry out a stunning escape from the Tower, England's most formidable prison. Now, we want to find out how this priest managed it.
Right, so here we have the tower. It's supposed to be super secure, and yet we've got a Catholic priest breaking out.
I know, it's extraordinary. It's some sort of English Alcatraz, but he manages to do it. Look at this. This is the tower in 1597. And he is kept here in the Salt Tower, so it's behind the moat, the outer wall, and the tower he's in is part of the inner wall. And he manages to break out. So I'd like you to piece together his escape.
Okay.
And I'll try and find out a bit more about him and delve into his background.
In the time of Father Gerard, less than 2% of the country were practicing Catholics. Yet this minority terrified England's Protestant rulers. Catholics were seen as an enemy within, more loyal to the Pope and Catholic Europe than to their Queen, Elizabeth I. Catholic worship was outlawed, and priests like John Gerard were ruthlessly hunted down.
Elizabeth's government had agents known as pursuivants who scoured the land looking for Catholic priests. The Catholics responded to the threat in both a logical and ingenious way, with priest holes.
These were life-saving hiding spaces used when the pursuivants came knocking. This house, Harvington Hall, has more of these hides than anywhere in England. I've enlisted priest hole expert Alice Hogg to reveal one secret spot the pursuivants never found.
Use your imagination a little bit. We've got a walled library with books everywhere. This end here, we've got a cupboard, which we open up the doors. We've got more books, we've got more panelling. But if you come up this way, this is where the hiding place is finally located, right behind this beam here.
Goodness me. Gosh, you can't be a fat priest, can you? Look at that.
This was a deadly game of hide and seek, and Gerard needed real endurance to play it.
He was in one for 4 hours, another time for 4 whole days, with no food other than a jar of quince jelly and some biscuits that his hostess had been able to give him before he went in. And
4 days?
4 days.
No water?
No water at all. And then the last time it was a 9-day search.
Life as a priest in hiding was tough, but Gerard was prepared. He trained for his covert mission in Rome before returning home at the age of 24. Ever since, he'd flitted between the homes of rich Catholics, hiding away when the pursuivants came calling.
So if these hides were so sophisticated, so secret, how has Gerard actually found them?
Well, it was an act of betrayal in the end. The family had a servant who wasn't a Catholic servant and betrayed him to the authorities.
So all these sophisticated hides were completely in vain and he ended up in the tower anyway?
Not in vain for other priests. They saved the lives of so many other priests, but for Gerard, no. It was an act of betrayal and that was him off to the tower.
Gerard was accused of being sent by the Pope on a political mission to pervert the Queen's loyal subjects. This was treason, and the sentence was death. Yet the authorities seemed reluctant to charge Gerard. Instead, he was locked up, interrogated, and finally left to rot in the tower.
In Protestant England, Catholic schools were banned. Would-be priests had to travel to colleges in Europe before secretly returning home. One of those colleges still exists today. Its HQ is no longer in France, but in Lancashire, Northern England.
Well, this is Stonyhurst ahead of me, and isn't it magnificent? I've heard there are some relics here from the time when Catholic priests were outlaws in their own land, and I'm hoping there's going to be some good information on secret priests, and in particular on Gerard, because I really want to know what made this guy so special that he could escape the Tower of London.
Gerard was one of dozens of foreign-trained priests operating in England. Here at Stonyhurst, curator Jan Graffius holds evidence of just how dangerous their job was.
This is a very special relic contained in this box, and inside is a human shoulder blade.
Really?
And this is a shoulder of one of 4 young men who were all trained on the continent as priests and all landed on the northeast coast near Durham, and they were immediately picked up and they were executed a matter of weeks later. And this is the penalty of sticking out.
To stay alive, a priest needed the skills of a secret agent and some very clever kit. Like a portable altar and a chalice for mass that could be dismantled and hidden.
John Gerard survived 18 years under these sorts of circumstances. He was very, very good. And luckily, when he returned back to Europe, his superiors, his Jesuit superiors said, "You have to write this down because we want to use your story as training for other priests." And so he wrote his story down, and that's how we know so much about him.
Gerard's memoirs became the handbook for secret priests, and Stonyhurst has a very early copy.
Do we get a sense from this, because this is his, hand, what life was like in the tower at that time?
Very clear. He sends his guard out to buy Pomat Aria Magna, big oranges, which he, the guard, seems to like eating. And so he's buying for himself luxuries, and he hands some of them back to the guard as a way of forming a friendship, forming a bond.
Yes, so a sense of relationships being built up here. Right, cut to the chase. How does John Gerard escape? There must be an account of it in here.
Very clear. It's a fascinating story, and he's written down every detail so we can follow it from here.
Well, John Gerard, what a star. If only all historical figures would write down their key thoughts and actions in an autobiography immediately, it would be incredibly useful, because I now know exactly how he escaped the tower, and let me tell you, it doesn't disappoint. Time to send Susie a message.
By 1597, Father Gerard had been locked up for 3 years and knew death was more likely than escape. No one had broken out of the tower for 30 years, so how did this priest manage it?
On the subject of Father John Gerard, Joe sent me a rather enigmatic note that says, "Dear Susie, here are some things worthy of your consideration, Joe." There's clearly more to this than meets the eye.
The 16th century saw the dawn of the British spy service, so Catholic priests in Protestant England had to get handy with secret messages. To crack this one, I'm heading to meet an expert in Elizabethan espionage, Robert Hutchinson.
I suspect very strongly that there is, in fact, some secret writing written on this piece of paper. And what we'll do is try the test. The heat affects the secret writing, which has a chemical reaction on the paper, which means when you heat it, what's been written or should show up. That's a T. There's a B. About. Is that about?
About, yes, it is,
About the OJ. OJ.
Orange juice.
Orange juice.
Okay, hence the orange crosses.
Yes. Now, we know that Gerard was very fond of oranges, but it wasn't just an issue of trying to boost his vitamin C intake. Orange juice was used as a secret ink. This is his means of communicating with his supporters outside the tower and his fellow prisoners within the tower.
Another Catholic rebel, John Arden, was held opposite Gerard's cell in the Cradle Tower, closer to the outside world. Gerard used orange juice letters to make contact, and his corruptible jailer to set up a visit.
He bribes his jailer to allow him to cross that courtyard to get to the Cradle Tower. Everyone has their price, especially in the 16th century. And that's where Gerard realised, with the stink of the Thames in his nostrils, just how close he was to chances of freedom.
Secret letters helped Gerard get into the Cradle Tower, where he saw that escape was possible. He used the same method with allies outside the tower to plot a prison break. But what was his cunning plan?
Father Gerard made his great escape 4 weeks after visiting Arden's cell for the first time. And I've returned to the scene to make sense of what Gerard pulled off that night.
So I've read Gerard's account, and now being here at the tower, it all starts to make sense. That Salt Tower, that's where he'd been imprisoned in his cell, and across this courtyard is Cradle Tower. That's where Arden was locked up in his cell. On the night, we know that Gerard persuaded his warder to bring him down from the tower through the gardens to Arden's cell. He persuaded him using golden reason, i.e. bribery. That tower gave them the best possible chance to escape. Gerard was brought up and locked behind this door with Arden. Now, meanwhile, two Catholic friends of Gerard were rowing their way up the Thames, docking their boat just on the wharf there and waiting to hear from their friends, because inside here, Arden and Gerard climbed up to the bottom, and there they had a stout thread attached to an iron ball. What they were going to do is throw this across to their friends waiting on the wharfside. And this was a really, really tense moment because, as Gerard writes, any splash, if they missed and it went in the moat, then immediately the game would be up. Gerard's Catholic friends waiting on the wharf hear this iron ball fall. They then attach a proper, sturdy, thick rope, and Gerard hauls it up onto the battlements. The other end is attached to a stake on the quayside, and Gerard then can make his way down the rope. Whether he's weak from torture, I don't know, but he really struggles with this. He gets stuck halfway.
At length I got to the middle, and there I was stationary. For my strength and spirits, which before were flagging, began entirely to fail me.
He sort of sums up all his belief, really, in God to see him through, so he's dangling there, and eventually he makes it and gets his feet up on the wall here. His friends pull him over, and he's exhausted. They revive him, they give him a drink, and they steal away to the boat waiting on the Thames. Just imagine how this moment would have felt for John Gerard as he boarded, away from the tower, from torture, from probable death, and on to freedom. John Gerard was never recaptured, and we know from his book, from his own words, that he went to live in Europe. He lived for another 40 years, well into his 70s. It's an incredible story, full of self-belief, passion, and a very daring escape from that place.
Bloody Tales of the Tower is back at the same time next week. After the break, brand new air crash investigation examines the Munich air disaster.